Question number 2, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. James, order. Order. Mr. English. James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads, does he stand by all his statements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, especially the one where I was shocked actually to find Greenpeace International on the database.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he stand by his statement that New Zealand is not a tax haven when the Australian Financial Review and the US Congressional Service have New Zealand on the map of tax havens?
Mr. Speaker.
Right
yes,
Honourable Prime Minister.
I stand very much by the view New Zealand is not a tax haven. In fact, New Zealand's been ranked as the most compliant in the highest category. There are 4 factors actually that would go into someone being a tax haven. The most important, of course, of which is secrecy, and New Zealand doesn't have that. And even prior to the Panama Papers, this government has been working towards automatic exchange, not just to Australia and FACTA, but 60 international jurisdictions.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he stand by his statement that the international media have not reported that New Zealand was a tax haven when more than 40 different international outlets from around the world, including USA Today, The Independent, The Telegraph, The Washington Times, The Australian, The AFT, The Age, The Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian, have reported on New Zealand's role in the Panama Papers?
The Right Honourable Prime
Speaker,
Minister.
yes, I stand very much by the view. If you look at the international reporting of this, New Zealand has been but a footnote. A single mention of New Zealand is not actually what's leading the news. And in Australia today, what they are talking about is not New Zealand when it comes to the Panama Papers. It's some issue in relation to Chinese money.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If New Zealand is not a tax haven, why would Mossack Fonseca, a company which by its own admission has 95% of its business in avoiding tax, urge its clients to use New Zealand's foreign trust and company structures as a way of avoiding tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 2 things. Firstly, there can be quite legitimate reasons why people have a foreign trust. I suggest the member leave the House and ring Greenpeace, Amnesty and Red Cross, because they are implicated in the papers. But more importantly that, just turn around and ask his colleague. Mojo Mathers has a foreign trust.
Supplementary.
If it requires me to ask someone to leave because they can consistently interject, I will do so. It's not my wish, but when the barrage continues, uninterrupted, particularly by a frontbench Labor member, they leave me no choice. James Shaw, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the conversation, when Mr. Whitney assured him that he had no links to Mossack Fonseca, did Mr. Whitney mention that he was a director of 2 companies with connections to Mossack Fonseca?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, I have no responsibility for that. But I stand by the statements I've made, which are that incrimination by insinuation, just because someone is mentioned. If you go into the database, the very first thing you have to do is tick a disclosure form.
Order. Point of order, James Shaw.
Point of order. I recognise it's a boisterous question time, Mr. Speaker, but it was a fairly specific question about a conversation that he had with Mr. Whitney.
Order. Order. I allowed the question. I thought about not allowing, because I don't think there is Prime Ministerial responsibility. The Prime Minister is certainly addressing the question. Difficult to hear because of the noise, I do accept, but on this occasion I can't help the member unless he has a more specific question. Did the Prime Minister... Order, I'm still on my feet. Did the Prime Minister, has he completed his answer to that question? Point of order. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, I submit, does have ministerial responsibility. He answered in this House about the reference that he made to the gentleman concerned to go to the Minister of Revenue and to the Department He referenced that conversation, which was within his role as Prime Minister. Clearly, he, as Prime Minister, in that conversation, came to the view that he should refer him to the Minister of Revenue. I cannot see how he can claim that he has no ministerial responsibility for what was told to him in that conversation, and therefore the question was in order.
Order. I think on this occasion the member makes a reasonable point. As I said in my point of order, it was a marginal call. I decided to leave the question standing. I certainly didn't rule it out. The Prime Minister then addressed it. Mr Shaw decided that or asked me whether it had been addressed to his satisfaction. On this occasion, I think it has been addressed, maybe not to the member's satisfaction. He can continue with the supplementary if he wishes.
Thank you.
Well, just to be absolutely sure, I've ruled on that matter. So to continue to raise another point of order that's anything to do with the question that's just been asked is in itself disorderly. But if it's a fresh point of order, something dealing with another matter that hasn't been raised, then I can hear it. But if we're just relitigating, that in itself is what's leading to this House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll proceed with my point of order, if I may.
Yes.
Your answer, sir, didn't refer to the fact that the Prime Minister declined to answer the question, saying it wasn't a matter of prime ministerial responsibility. That is my point of order. In fact, you have conceded that it was a matter of prime ministerial responsibility. Therefore, it cannot be addressing the question to deny that it was.
Now, the members now, just going back over correctly, I acknowledge I had some difficulty hearing the detail of the answer simply because of the noise. I have ruled then that the Prime Minister did accept the question. I ruled it in order. Order! My patience won't last much longer with Mr Parker. Well, then the member can stand and leave the chamber.
That is outrageous.
Member can leave. Member can leave the chamber. Further supplementary, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Prime Minister...
Order. James Shaw.
Will the Prime Minister now take this opportunity to broaden the review of foreign trusts into a full-scale inquiry into tax avoidance?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no. There are two elements, if you think about the whole issue for just a moment. One of those in relation to disclosure and whether disclosure is adequate in New Zealand. And what is happening in relation to that is I think we've got the finest tax mind in the country to look at that issue, and we'll come up with recommendations, and if they're good recommendations, the government will implement them. The second part of it is in relation to tax treatment of trusts, and again, the government is working both with the OECD but also with our like-minded partners to see if there is more that we can do because of the mismatches and the arbitrages that happen around the world. Both of those elements of what we are doing, I believe, address this issue. The third point I'd make is the point I made earlier on, that of all of the mentions in the database, the 500,000 and the excitement that some people have brought to this issue, there are less than 200 trusts registered in New Zealand that have a link to Mossack Fonseca, and of those less than 200 in total, all of them that the IRD have taken a quick look at have been disclosed. In other words, fully subject to exchange of information, fully subject to making sure that IRD can see them, and I suspect with a great many of them likely to be subject to the anti-money laundering rules because they're likely to be established by a Tier 1 firm who's a part of Part 1.
Order. Question number 3.